Hello, it's Cried here with the long-awaited breakdown for Greatswords. Greatswords is the weapon type with the most weapons, totaling 21 Greatswords. They also have plenty of unique weapons, with more unique weapons than most weapon classes have weapons. There are 12 unique Greatswords, and plenty of them are quite good, at least by PvE standards. You definitely know this is one of the devs' favorite weapon types. Let's quickly get the ranges of the Greatswords out of the way. The ranges look bunched up right now because there are so many, but we will be using this data later when we're comparing Greatswords. Next, let us take a look at some of the different movesets of Greatswords and the different motion values or damage percent. Greatswords have vastly different one-handed and two-handed movesets. Let us start with the light attacks. This is the normal one-handed light attack chain of Greatswords. This is the normal two-handed light attack chain of Greatswords. This is the two-handed light attack chain of the Inseparable Sword, Knight's Greatsword, and Banished Knight's Sword. These swords only have a different light attack chain on the two-handed version. The light attack chain draws huge swings. Because of the different animation combined with the hit stuns these swords can produce, you can true combo the following moves with a two-handed moveset. Enjoy some clips here by Lamautan showcasing these combos. Moving on to the heavy attacks. This is the normal one-handed heavy and charged heavy attacks of Greatswords. This is the normal two-handed heavy and charged heavy attack of the Greatswords. For the heavy attacks, the first weapon I want to mention is the Alabaster Lord's Sword. While it has the same animation as the normal heavy attack and charged heavy attack, it has a higher motion value, otherwise known as MV or damage percent, for each swing. The extra MV is especially noticeable on the two-handed version, which is to say, if you're swinging two Greatswords with the exact same AR distribution like the Alabaster's, this sword will do more damage with its heavy attack. However, as you will find out later, the Alabaster's sword has lower than average AR, so these MVs get balanced out by poor AR. This is the heavy and charged heavy attack of the Flamberge. The Flamberge's one-handed heavy and charged heavy attack animation are very similar to the normal two-handed Greatsword heavy and charged heavy animation, which means it kind of has the same heavy attack moveset, regardless of whether you one-hand or two-hand it. The heavy attack and charged heavy attack of the Claymore is a poking attack. This also applies to its two-handed moveset. Furthermore, while two-handing the weapon, the rolling and crouching attack are also poking attacks that do pierce damage, which can counter hit. This is the heavy attack and charged heavy attack of the Sword of Milos and Death's Poker. You can tell this heavy attack is sort of meant to be charged on the first one because it does a run-up. This moveset also applies to its two-handed version. One more thing to note is, for the Sword of Milos, after using its weapon art, its heavy attack changes into these consecutive swings. This is the heavy and charged heavy attack of the Darkmoon Greatsword. It looks a bit weird and sort of telegraphed because this heavy attack is tied to its weapon art, Moonlight Greatsword. Moonlight Greatsword buffs the Darkmoon Greatsword by 65 magic damage and 15 frost buildup. It also adds a ranged projectile to the heavy attacks of the Darkmoon Greatsword. The physical swing itself counts as the heavy attack, while the bonus sword beam counts as the weapon art. This is the heavy and charged heavy attack of the Marais Executioner Sword. The difference is on the second heavy attack. This heavy attack also applies to the two-handed version. Next, Let's take a look at the attack rating, otherwise known as AR, of the weapons and do some deeper analysis, starting with the unique weapons. First up, we have the Sword of Milos. This is an interesting weapon with a passive that grants you 5 FP per kill, or basically when something dies on your screen, including phantoms, as long as you are holding this sword or two-handing something with this sword in your other hand. The requirements for the weapon do not have to be met for this passive to work, so you can use this sword as a passive stick. But what if we want to swing this sword? With a quality build that leans more towards dexterity, this sword actually has an okay amount of AR with the bleed status effect. The Shriek of Milos is also a unique weapon art that increases this sword's physical attack by 7.5% and slightly increases the strength scaling. It also changes the heavy attack of the Sword of Milos and reduces all damage negation of enemy within range by 15%. Truly a weapon art that has a lot going on, just like the weapon itself. Oh, and this debuff has a PvP modifier, turning it to only a 5% negation debuff. I know someone fixes Vextra's view farming wiki after watching my videos, so I thought I might point it out. The community definitely thanks you. Alabaster Lord's Sword, like its curved sword counterpart, is meh at best. It deals 30% more damage to void enemies, but who really cares? The unique weapon art, Alabaster Lord's Pool, isn't that great in my opinion, and the AoE scales to intelligence, which only has a D rating for scaling. If we start out with some strength investment in order to allow this greatsword to have a not garbage level amount of AR, and then add 32 intelligence to hit the 50 intelligence soft cap, we're only getting 22.23 AR. Very little. 705 AR for a split scaling greatsword is also low on AR. This also happens to be the shortest greatsword. Overall, a weak weapon with a tad bit of utility on the pull-in weapon art. Still, there is no need for a pull-in if you can just wipe entire areas of mobs, as you will see with the other better unique greatswords. The Dark Moon Greatsword, otherwise known as DMGS, is a crowd favorite for intelligence players. I've covered the weapon art in the different moveset section. The heavy attack is quite obvious and is certainly more suited for PvE. This move can be very FP efficient because it only costs FP to cast the buff. All the subsequent heavy attacks only require stamina. Since the buff lasts for 60 seconds, you can do quite a lot of damage with a single cast. The weapon itself also allows for pure intelligence investment after the base requirements are met, which means that you can combine it easily with a staff on your offhand. Not to mention, it also has frostbite buildup. With higher AR than the Alabasters and longer reach on the weapon itself, you can probably see why I said that Alabaster's Lord's Greatsword is quite a bad weapon. The DMGS doesn't have an exceptionally high AR. It is because the Alabaster's has poor scaling. To prove that, we can take a look at the next weapon, Helphen's Steeple, which also uses a strength and intelligence investment. You can immediately see that it has much higher AR than the Alabaster's. Its unique weapon art, Ruinous Ghostflame, is a quick applying buff that grants the greatsword a 50 magic damage bonus and 80 frost buildup for 30 seconds. In terms of frostbite buildup, this thing has a slight edge over the DMGS and a slightly longer reach. However, the buff does last only half as long and does not grant you a ranged attack on your heavy attacks. Since its best investment is into strength and intelligence, it doesn't combine as well with staffs as the DMGS when you don't have enough stat points to max everything out. But if you're going for a pure melee fighting style with a greatsword, Steeple's faster buff application makes buffing mid-fight much smoother and safer. The choice is yours. Death's pokers, explosions, and ghost flames all scale purely off intelligence, so even though it has abysmal amounts of magic damage and D rating in intelligence only, this is the stat you want to invest in. It has very low AR with this investment, but that doesn't matter. If you're going to be using this weapon, it would be because of its flexible and powerful weapon art, Ghost Flame Ignition, which has answers to both short and long distance enemies. Following up the weapon art with a light attack will create a long-lasting trail of Ghost Flame in front of you. Following up the weapon art with a heavy attack will create a large explosion of Ghost Flame in front of you. The weapon art builds up quite a bit of frostbite as well. Heck, just look at the weapon. It doesn't even look like a greatsword. Treat this one like a big wand. Ordovis Greatsword is a strength scaling greatsword. The weapon art, Ordovis Vortex, is very fancy, but slow and mediocre at best. It also scales to the attack rating of the weapon itself, so you don't need to invest into faith at all. Simply rush straight to 80 strength for the most damage on both the weapon itself and on the weapon art. The faith is just for decoration and for when you max out for PvE. This sword is not something I would use for practical purposes, especially when there are much better AoE weapon arts. Gargoyle's Blackblade is in the same boat as the Ordovis's. If you want to focus on the weapon art, you would want to invest into faith, but as you can see here, strength investment helps the AR much more. Frankly speaking, the weapon art is fairly short distance, and its damage isn't great. The Black Flame application from the weapon art can be useful against some higher HP targets, but not a strong weapon overall. Sacred Relic Sword is one of the two great swords with 110 critical boost. It has a very strong AoE weapon art that scales to faith. Wave of Gold deals very high damage and goes incredibly far. This weapon art covers a massive area. In terms of AR though, it actually scales much better to dexterity, which you probably do want to invest in. First of all, dexterity helps you cast your incantations faster, so it doesn't go unused. Secondly, the weapon art costs a whopping 42 FP, so it is expensive to spam. Of course, your stat investment is definitely dependent on your build. You can use this weapon solely for its weapon art as an AoE tool to your incantation build, so either dexterity or faith investment has their own merits. Next comes the Golden Order Sword, which deals plus 20% damage to undead enemies and prevents skeletons from reviving. For those of you who care about lore, it is strongly implied that this sword is reforged from the Darkmoon Greatsword. You can see that this weapon's follow-up on the weapon art looks very similar to the heavy attack of the Darkmoon Greatsword, and also sends out a slash of light. However, the initial charge up is very lengthy, even though you do gain 200 hyper armor. For the most part, since its AR and purpose of the weapon art are very similar to the Sacred Relic, I would typically recommend the Sacred Relic over the Golden Order Sword. The Inseparable Blade has a normal weapon art you can get from Ashes of War. It also deals plus 20% damage to undead enemies and prevents skeletons from reviving. The main selling point is definitely the unique moveset. We will compare this sword with the two other infusible versions more in depth later, but this is its AR. One thing to note is that this sword has a relatively high strength and dexterity requirement for a weapon that scales to faith. The Blasphemous Blade. A weapon YouTubers love to make builds with. Why? Because the weapon art is insanely overpowered in PvE, doing high damage while healing you for 10% max HP plus 150 HP on hit. Furthermore, this greatsword has a passive that heals you for 4% max HP and 40 flat HP per enemy death while held. The build people usually post typically ends up as spamming the Blasphemous Blade's weapon art, Taker's Flame, with a Shard of Alexander. Invest in faith and fill in the rest with whatever combination you want, such as Fire Scorpion Charm and Dragon Crest Great Shield, to deal more damage while making your health points worth more. Use the Carrion Filigree Crest to spam even more weapon art while your level is not high enough for extra might. Remember to invest into Vigor so you can tank moves. Offhand the seal for buffs and longer ranged abilities. There, I just made one of the most OP builds in PvE 2 in less than 30 seconds. 2 videos in one. Holy cow, what a deal. Marais' Executioner's Sword has no status effect and cannot be infused or buffed while scaling to Arcane. However, you will still invest into Arcane for maximum damage, because the Arcane portion scales both the physical and magic damage portion of the weapon, whereas the strength and dexterity only scale the physical portion. For a split scaling greatsword at 11.5 weight, this weapon does not have a high AR. If you're running this weapon, you're definitely going for the weapon art, Eochad's Dancing Blade, which can be combined with both multi-hit talismans to do incredible amounts of damage. Moving on to the regular greatswords, we have the Forked Greatsword, Bastard Sword, Lordsworn's Greatsword, Gargoyle's Greatsword, Iron Greatsword, Flamberg, Claymore, Knight's Greatsword, and Banished Knight's Greatsword. Starting with the first sheet of the Heavy Infusion, I have all the greatswords that have a regular moveset from lightest to heaviest, and on the second sheet, I have the greatswords with the different movesets. Take a look at these numbers for now, and we will discuss more details in a second, after looking over the dexterity versions too. These are the stats for 80 strength. Fire is the split damage version of heavy, which is usually better at lower strength investment, like 50 strength, but worse at 80 strength. There are no big outliers for the fire infusion for greatswords, and for PvP, fire defense is usually high. Nothing too stellar about this category. Moving on to the keen infusion, these are the numbers for the first soft cap. If you are comparing numbers, you will realize that most greatswords scale better to strength. We will quickly look through some more numbers for the keen infusion's 80 dexterity soft cap here, and draw some conclusions soon. This is the lightning infusion for greatswords. For PvP, lightning infusion tends to be preferred over the fire, because lightning defense is always the lowest. This is the 80 dexterity investment. One thing to note is, while the Knight's Greatsword has a slight lead on the Banished Knight's Greatsword in terms of AR with a keen infusion, it actually loses by a wider margin when it comes to the lightning infusion. Alright, it's time for some analysis. First, let's split the weapons into what they're better at. Weapons like the Bastard Sword are labeled strength, because I don't suggest running them with dexterity. Weapons in the middle, like the Lord Sword, have a small difference between strength and dexterity, but is a bit better on strength. Weapons like the Forked and Knights, on the other hand, also have a small difference, but prefer dexterity, and the Flamberge is better with dexterity investment. Next, let us take a look at the 5 greatswords with a normal moveset. First of all, their lengths are relatively similar. In fact, these 3 swords I've circled have the same length. The Forked Sword is the shortest, and is also the only one that scales better to dexterity on this list, and also has lead, so let's set it aside for now. The Lord Sword has consistently lower AR for the sake of its 110 critical boost. With the same weight, the Bastard Sword has 6% more AR, which basically means that unless well over half of your attacks with the Lord Sword are critical strikes, the Bastard Sword will have a better performance. And if over half of your attacks are critical strikes, please just use a Misericord. As for how the Bastard Sword compares to its heavier counterparts, it has 3 less weight than the Iron Greatsword. If we convert that into medium raw weight, we get 4.3 weight, which is roughly 3 to 5 endurance, without either of the equip load talismans. Now, if we check out the heavy infusion, since all of these swords scale better to heavy, we can see the AR difference. I gave 1 more strength to the Gargoyle compared to the Iron Sword because it has 0.5 less weight. Oftentimes, this 0.5 extra weight won't even matter, but still, let's go for a safer assumption. The Gargoyle has the same AR as the Iron here, which means that it is still worse than the Iron because the Iron Greatsword has longer reach. And obviously, if we compare the Lord Sword, which already lost to the Bastard Sword, to the Iron Greatsword, we see a 7.7% AR difference. Roughly the same conclusions can be drawn for the lower soft cap. I repeated the steps I did for the 80 strength soft cap, and you can see that the Iron Greatsword is still in the lead. This slide is to show that even at 99 strength, the Gargoyle's AR will be similar and not quite as high as the Iron Greatsword's. In terms of strength scaling, the Gargoyle's is a tad bit higher, but it never beats the Iron Greatsword after accounting for the base damage. And if you're going for 99 strength, endurance really isn't your problem. So the conclusion is, Iron Greatsword eliminates the 3 other Greatswords. Now, what about the Forked Greatsword? It just so happens that there is another Greatsword with base bleed that happens to scale better to dexterity, the Flamberge. There is a slight difference in moveset, but it only comes into play if you one-hand the Greatsword, and for some reason you really prefer one over the other. Other than that, we're looking at the second shortest Greatsword versus the 4th longest. The requirements are quite similar, and there is only 1 weight difference with the same base bleed. But even if we account for all of that, Flamberge has a significantly higher AR than the Forked Sword, weighing in at nearly 8% higher AR. Therefore, the Flamberge eliminates the Forked Greatsword from the competition. Okay, you know the drill. Quality is very inefficient at meta PvP levels, which is around 125 to 150. You can always do better with either the heavy or the keen version for the same amount of investment. The main use of quality is when you have loads of stat points at endgame PvE levels. Flame and Sacred are two sides of the same coin at max weapon upgrades. You are only deciding between the element. Again, if you peek at the Iron Greatsword's numbers, you will see that it is significantly higher. There is, however, an interesting comparison to be made, and I will be doing it with the Flame and Sacred infusion to kill two birds with one stone. We are going to take a look at the 3 Greatswords with a unique light attack chain that provides many true combos. Whether by coincidence or not, they all weigh 10 weight. From the previous numbers, you will see that the Knights only barely beats the Banished Knights in terms of AR for the Keen infusion, and loses by a wider margin for the other infusions. But if we take a look at the Greatsword lengths, we can see that the Knight's Greatsword is significantly longer than the Banished Knights. I would say that both Greatswords can be considered. How about the Inseparable, that is even shorter and has a higher requirement? The Inseparable does indeed have a higher AR. PvE wise, it also has the passive for preventing skeleton revival. Rather than the AR and weapon length though, you kind of need to ask yourself whether you want the Sacred Blade weapon art. Because the unique moveset only applies to two-handed moveset, it is difficult to run any of these weapons with something else like a seal. So, if you're going to be running the Knights or Banished Knights on Flame or Sacred, it is probably because you want to be using one of the following weapon arts. Otherwise, you can simply choose another infusion and weapon art, like Keen infusion with Beast's Roar or Heavy infusion with Flaming Strike as some examples. So the conclusion is, all 3 Greatswords can be used for their own reasons to fine-tune your build. Magic infusion basically functions like the intelligence counterpart of Flame and Sacred. You're going to be choosing this option mainly because the infusible weapon art of choice scales to intelligence, or you're trying to offhand a staff. If your main source of damage is attacking with your Greatsword, you will probably prefer the Occult infusion. Occult infusion is once again the messiest infusion to cover. The Gargoyles and Iron prefer a strength investment. The Bastard's Sword and Claymore prefer a strength and intelligence investment. The 4th Greatsword, Blackblade, and Knight's Greatsword prefer a dexterity and intelligence investment. And finally, the Lordsworn and Banished Knights prefer a weird 3-way split. This 3-way split has resulted in a very subpar AR for the Banished Knights, creating another infusion where you would prefer the Knights over the Banished Knights for sure. Next comes the Poison infusion. If you're only using one Greatsword, you will likely prefer the Blood infusion over the Poison infusion, as it is a better status for the most part. Something I do want to point out though, is for the Poison and Blood infusion, the Iron Greatsword has quite a bit more AR than everything else. The Occult infusion is typically not as good as the Heavy and Keen counterparts, unless your weapon has a base status effect that scales to Arcane, which allows you to double dip into the status effects and the AR. Since we compared the 4th Greatsword to the Flamberge already, it is probably to nobody's surprise that the Flamberge beats the 4th Greatsword, even with the Occult infusion. Alright, let's do a quick summary. The Sword of Milos has a passive that helps sustain your FP for general exploration, as long as it is held. The weapon art also applies a unique debuff that reduces the enemy's negation and changes your heavy attack. With base bleed and decent AR, this weapon is actually fairly decent, and can be used in an array of builds. The Marais Executioner's Sword has a strong weapon art that can fully abuse the consecutive hit talismans to deal a truckload of damage. The AR of the weapon itself is actually on the lower side, especially for its weight, and as a split scaling weapon. Remember to invest into Arcane, as it scales both the physical and magic damage of the sword. The Ordovis Greatsword receives a S for style. It is actually a strength weapon with next to no practical usage. I'm actually covering it here instead of covering it with the other faith weapons, simply to save space. For the intelligence-based greatswords, we start off with another bad greatsword, the Alabaster Lord's Sword. It is the shortest greatsword that comes with low AR and a mediocre weapon art. Not a greatsword I'd recommend. The Dark Moon Greatsword has a unique weapon art that can really save FP for you. It is a powerful weapon in PvE, but for PvP, the heavy attacks are quite telegraphed, so it won't really work well on better players. Helphen's Steeple has a fast weapon art buff, and its specs are slightly higher than the Dark Moon Greatswords if you aren't planning to use the sword beams from the Dark Moon Greatsword. The Death's Poker is a wand with a powerful weapon art that scales purely off intelligence, so invest into intelligence even though you'll see abysmal amounts of AR gain. As for the faith-based greatswords, we start off with a god tier PvE weapon that is practically a build in and of itself, the Blasphemous Blade. If you want something that can carry you through PvE, you found it. The Inseparable Blade will mainly be chosen due to its unique light attack chain moveset that it shares with the Knight's Greatsword and the Banished Knights. Gargoyle's Blackblade has a meh weapon art, although it does apply Black Flame, so it works fine on targets with high health. However, if your animation is going to be that similar to Blasphemous Blade, you're bound to be compared, especially because there are such good options for greatswords. I don't think this one is great at all. The Sacred Relic sword happens to be the longest greatsword and also has 110 critical boost, but the main selling point of this weapon is definitely its weapon art, Wave of Gold, with fat damage and huge area coverage. I think it is better than the Golden Order Greatsword that has a slower weapon art that is also an AoE, mainly because the Golden Order Greatsword's weapon art is very slow. For the regular greatswords, I've done a lot of specific explanations in the regular section if you want the details. The Flamberge basically beats the Fork Greatsword and is your best option for an Occult Greatsword. This doesn't mean you can't run it on other infusions. I'm just saying, if you're going for an Occult Greatsword, this is your best bet. The plainest looking greatsword here, the Iron Greatsword, eliminates the other greatswords on the list after taking into account weight and Lordscorn's 110 critical boost. It just has a high AR overall on any infusion, and a solid choice if you just want the regular moveset. For the regular greatswords, we still have the Claymore, which I haven't covered in detail yet. You would run the Claymore for its colossal sword-like poking attacks with its two-handed moveset, while being able to use other moves that belong to the greatswords. It is 6.5 weight lighter than even the lightest colossal sword, but the downside is, you must two-hand it for its poking crouch and rolling attacks. As for the Knights and Banished Knights with a unique light attack chain, they're pretty similar. The Knights is longer and typically has a lower AR. I recommend it for the Keen and Cold infusion. If you want a higher AR, the Banished Knight has higher AR and is better for strength-oriented builds. Honestly, these two greatswords and Inseparable aren't that different overall. Just take your pick and use them to do some cool true combos in PvP. If you enjoyed this video or my analytical content, you can buy my newly published book, The House of Hounds, to support my channel. These videos take a lot of time and research. I really do need some help getting the book into the algorithm so that I don't have to worry about funds and have more spare time to make YouTube content. Thank you for watching. See you next time.